Final Fantasy Endwalker. An emotional, moving story of hope against a nihilistic despair, traveling to the very ends of existence to fight to save the world. Even but a cursory look at player reactions shows the passions which this story evokes in its readers. Fear, worry, depressed nihilistic feelings, even despair, but finally culminating in hope and peace. And of course, a saved world. And along the way, the story explores philosophical concepts central enough to the human heart and experience that many players, even those generally uninterested in philosophy, begin to ponder these deepest of questions. What is the meaning of life? Where do we find this meaning if it exists? And if there is an answer, why is this the meaning of life? Does this really satisfy us? These questions and many more have been pondered by philosophers and humans throughout all of history. The question of the meaning of life isn't a new question. So for those of you interested in knowing how Endwalker's approach to this question matches up or doesn't match up with philosophers' answers and generally human answers throughout history, for those of you curious on how this has been answered in the past, and for those of you who simply want to know whether this question has an answer or not, especially given the deep nihilistic turn that this story takes at times, that's what we're here to discuss. That's what I'm here to rant about. So, to begin then, let's take a look at what Endwalker does and doesn't actually say about this problem in the story. The story begins far back, way back at 1.0 and 2.0, where players started playing the game in a realm reborn. But the philosophical story of Endwalker, so to speak, really begins when Hermes asks a fundamental question which begins the entire existential journey. What do other civilizations believe the meaning of life to be? And how can we learn from that and find our own meaning of life? Such was Hermes' question. Such is the reason he created Meteon and her sisters. And we can see this in the scene where he launches Meteon's sisters into space to begin their journey.
All units fully functional and proceeding on course towards their respective stars. Estimated time to completion of survey is 108 cycles. End of status report. Severing connection with shared consciousness.
Did you hear that, Hermes? All is well.
Yes, good tidings at long last. Every step of the way, I've been reminded how little we understand creation. How the universe defies imagination.
But soon we won't need to speculate. We'll know the answers. What others live for.
Indeed. And we'll owe it all to you and your sisters.
I wonder what answers we will get.
Whatever intelligent beings that exist out there are bound to be vastly different from us. Diverse in form and culture. Possessed of unique ways of thinking. Their conception of life and its purpose will be no exception. Completely and utterly unlike ours.
Utterly unlike... how?
I have no idea. Yet whatever answers we receive, I will not dismiss them out of hand. No, I will think earnestly on them all. And I will share them with our people, that together we may contemplate our own existence. Perhaps then our star will become a better place. Not only for man, but for all life. Meteon, as though I gave you wings to soar the heavens, I did not teach you how to walk the earth. So loath was I to bind another living being. In the course of your long journey, you will learn from those you meet, learn to walk and run and so much more. And when you return, older and wiser, we will have a celebration to mark your homecoming and coming of age both.
Will there be apples? Covered in syrup?
And how are you supposed to eat them? Rather than food, perhaps... a flower. Yes. Upon your return, I will gift you a beautiful flower.
The prospects of a good answer appear to fall drastically when Meteon's sisters return with the chilling response that every single civilization queried ended up collapsing in despair. Whether it be to disease, or to war, or even an eternal utopia that simply became empty and boring and meaningless. Cue Meteon becoming the end singer, the ancients forming Zodiac to protect the planet, Hydaelyn's long-term plan to save the star, and hopefully destroy the end singer, and so on till our hero's victory against Meteon, saving the planet, all in the name of hope. But one thing never happens, finding an actual answer. On the contrary, many of the characters exhibit despair themselves over whether there really is any meaning to life or to existence, and they never found a civilization that gave a positive answer to Hermes' query. So the question, while left open, leaves a sour taste on one's tongue, and a rather depressing outlook on the question in general. But how has this question been approached by philosophy? Do any of these thoughts and opinions of characters correspond to philosophers' thoughts? How would these philosophers approach these thought experiment worlds featured in the Dead Ends dungeon, for example? To delve into that, let's take a look at what philosophers have said about this question in general. In the meaning of life. It's a big philosophical question. I don't think I really need to clarify why that's a big philosophical question. But it's present for most of human history, right? Every person wonders what the meaning of their life is, what the purpose of it all is, why they exist. And ultimately, there's two kinds of answers to this question. The first being that there is, in fact, some kind of objective, real meaning to life. And the other, of course, saying there is no objective, real meaning to life. The problem with Endwalker is that this part of the tree, the objective, real meaning, just isn't explored at all. Instead, it's mostly focused on the question of if there's no objective real meaning, then we have our answers between is there some subjective meaning? This is often taken to mean existentialism. But in particular, it's not really existentialism as a whole. It's what we call Sartre, or Jean-Paul Sartre existentialism. So existentialism as a whole actually includes many different opinions on these subjects, which includes some objective and real meaning ones, such as Kierkegaard, for example. So not all existentialists are in the subjective meaning camp, but existentialism also has come to mean Jean-Paul Sartre's particular existentialism, which is also tied into Nietzsche Nietzsche's style of existentialism. Even though he kind of came before most of the existentialists, so it's kind of hard to precisely call him an existentialist in that same sense. But I mean, his philosophy is tied into it. So for purposes of our explanation, we're just going to throw him in there with Jean-Paul Sartre, because in both cases, this kind of existentialism focuses on the question of the will to power in terms of Nietzsche. And for Sartre, it's the radical freedom. These are the big slogans that they use, right? Will to power for Nietzsche, radical freedom for Jean-Paul Sartre. And behind this idea is that of self-determination of meaning in life. As Sartre himself says, I believe the quote is something like, exigency is not derived from meaning. Meaning is derived from exigency. Meaning that we are according to Sartre, we aren't born with meaning. Rather, we have a need for something, a desire for something, and from that we can derive meaning from it. Nietzsche and Sartre and other existentialists in this domain find that there is no objective real meaning in that sense, but there is a subjective meaning whereby we determine our own nature, our own fate, our own self. But on the other hand, over here, we have what most people probably prefer to term as nihilism. Whoops, I don't know what that is. Or a lack of any meaning at all. There's someone who's not exactly a nihilist, but Camus, also an existentialist. Well, he actually, I don't know if I should say that, because he's called an existentialist by people, but he actually, when he wrote to Jean-Paul Sartre, he didn't like the fact that he was called an existentialist, because he's kind of opposing a lot of existentialist, in particular Sartre and Nietzsche's thoughts on this. Because for Camus, his objection to the Sartre style existentialism is that the subjective meaning is simply another fake meaning. In reality, for Camus, the only question is why not, or why should one not commit suicide? The reason he asks this question is because if there is no real meaning to anything, then why is it preferable to live than to die? If there's no actual meaning for anything at all, then that means that if you compare two states of being, that there's no way to actually prefer one state to another state, because there's no real meaning for either of them. And if that's the case, then why should one be preferred? Any and every reason to prefer one state over another state would imply that one has a meaning which the other doesn't, or one has a value which the other doesn't, or a goodness which the other doesn't. And well, meaning, value, goodness are all kind of related words when we're talking about philosophy. So if there is no meaning at all, then there's no reason to prefer any state to another state. There's no reason to prefer life to death. And Camus came to this question of why should not one commit suicide? And this is where you find like the myth of Sisyphus. That's one of Camus's works. And in this work, Camus argues that though we are faced with the absolute absurdity of our existence, which is meaninglessness, even though we have that absolute absurdity, we can still find not meaning, but a kind of value, in a sense, to our absurd existence and toil. And he uses the myth of Sisyphus, which, if you aren't aware, is someone who for eternity has to push a boulder up a hill, and then the boulder falls back down. And then he pushes it back up again, and it falls back down. And it seems meaningless, right? There's no actual, I guess instead of find value, I should say take pride. And because if we say find value, then it's, again, instantiating some kind of meaning, which there isn't any for Camus, or for the nihilists in general. But he argues that even though there's no meaning to rolling the boulder up the hill, we can still take a kind of pride in it. We can still say this is what we are, right? In the face of an absurd existence, we can defy fate. We can continue to strive forward and be who we are. We can roll it up the hill, even though knowing it'll fall back down, even knowing it's meaningless. We still own it. We still own who we are. In that sense, it is similar to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche's will to power is ultimately Nietzsche's also answer to the question of suicide, in a sense. Except for Nietzsche, it's more so a question of nihilism, of destructive nihilism. Because for Nietzsche, and for Camus, in a sense, there exists a destructive nihilism, which seeks to destroy. So it's not merely nihilism, because mere nihilism is just a lack of meaning at all. And in which case, why would you prefer to destroy something? Because whether something exists or doesn't exist, there's no difference between those two states, so there's no reason to act at all in any way. So destructive nihilism isn't actually nihilism, it's just something that Nietzsche and Camus, to a degree, have been talking about, which is for Nietzsche, it's a destructive force. For Camus, it's the question of suicide. But they're related, right? You can see a kind of relation between these two topics that they're talking about. When Nietzsche talks about you need a will to power to avoid destruction nihilism, to forge oneself, or I guess to, I don't know the exact term that Nietzsche used, I don't recall. But will to power to avoid the weak-willed answer, to despair, enter into destructive nihilism. For Camus, well, we already wrote that up there. So that is, in a sense, the existentialist answer. There also, of course, is the, just pure nihilism. Or I'll call it pure virtue nihilism, I should say, because nihilism can be used in different ways. The word isn't just one specific thing, right? There are different ways you can use this word. And pure value nihilism would be that just there's no meaning at all. No meaning at all, no preferred states of being, because there's no difference, since there's no difference in states of being with respect to goodness, value, meaning. So in this sense, according to pure value nihilism, there's just no meaning at all. Nothing matters. Yeah, it's all meaningless. So according to value nihilism, there's really just there's nothing. There's no morals, because you can't prefer one state to another, so there's no ought to have one state instead of another. There's no goodness because there's nothing to be preferred from one state to another. And there's really no being either, because if the two separate states of being don't matter, then the lack of being doesn't matter either. So in a sense, nihilism kind of just destroys everything. That's why they call it destructive nihilism in a sense, because according to nihilism, there's just no, none of them. There's nothing. It doesn't matter at all. There's no being itself is irrelevant, which means everything's irrelevant, which means there really doesn't need to be anything at all. The question of why existence for a pure value nihilist is, well, there is no why. There is no existence, really. Or if there is existence, it doesn't really matter. This obviously is not a very healthy idea, because our entire human experience is that things do matter. We do, in fact, prefer states to one state over another, right? We do, in fact, prefer a comfortable, pleasant life to a painful, to a painful and sad life that we just end with death, right? That's obviously you prefer a more healthy, more vibrant life. Obviously you prefer to avoid pain and sorrow and suffering. Obviously we desire certain goods. So pure value nihilism is probably the worst answer of all the ones so far. But as Camus objects to these answers, the subjective meaning alone, when I say subjective meaning, I should say only subjective meaning, by the way. Because if we have objective real meaning, there's also a subjective component to it, in the sense of there is a real objective meaning out here, and I am subjectively experiencing this real objective meaning. So if we want to be more specific, I should say this is objective real meaning with which we understand subjectively, and this is no objective real meaning, but we only have a subjective experience of meaning, or there really just is no meaning at all. And Camus's objection to the subjective meaning alone is that the subjective meaning is just fake. If there's no objective meaning, then the subjective meaning isn't based on a reality, on an actual thing, an existence. It's fake. And that's why Camus, in a sense, is a nihilist, but in a sense is also an existentialist, because he also still says there is a reason not to commit suicide. There's still a reason to prefer one state to another state. So it's not exactly clear-cut, but I wouldn't exactly call him a pure value nihilist either, even though he tends to suggest that in some sense. He also tends to suggest a more, still not exactly subjective meaning, but a rejection of pure value nihilism and death and destructive nihilism. Anyway, so this is all this is kind of the branch that Endwalker observes and looks into. The problem is you don't really see this at all. There's no question about objective and real meaning, and I'll get into why Endwalker only focuses on this part of the tree, so to speak. I'll get into that, because there is reasons why, and it's quite an interesting thing to delve into. But it ignores this entirely, and this is sad, because this is a whole, if we're talking about philosophy, the majority of philosophers throughout history have focused on this. Objective real meaning. Even today, there's plenty of philosophers and people who believe in real meaning to things. It's not like it's a niche idea, it's the majority idea. I think in the most recent philosophy paper survey, it was pretty even between objective real meaning and subjective meaning. These two were kind of evenly matched. And then nihilism was the minority view. But yeah, objective real meaning is, it's fit. First of all, it's probably the most healthy answer, because we're actually asserting there is meaning to life. There is a reason to prefer some states of existence to another, which is kind of our common sense answer as well, is this one. And a lot of other philosophies are tied into it. And it's just throwing them out doesn't make any sense. If you want to know the truth, you should examine the entire question of the meaning of life and all the reasons behind it. So objective real meaning, the first thing I would like to point out is, again, it can, oops, I should erase that. It conforms to intuition, common sense. Right? Because we feel instinctively that things do have meaning. We feel instinctively that when we see a beautiful sunset, for example, that it is in fact beautiful. It's not just the sunset doesn't actually have any real beauty. I just perceive the beauty. No, it's like, I think it's actually good. When you see a beautiful and good thing, part of you feels, I am glad that this exists. It is a good thing that this exists. And that's saying that thing has meaning. That thing has value in and of itself. So that's our innocent, very much an intuitive belief in objective and real meaning, even if it's more abstract at that point. But the question of objective real meaning then asks, but then the question of real meaning asks, what is this meaning? Where does it come from? Or what principle do we derive this meaning from? And this gets into this is where they start to split off into a bunch of different philosophies, right? There's a ton of papers about this, but I'm not going to try to go into all of them right now. I'll just focus on some of the more historically relevant ones. For example, there's the question of teleology. Teleology being, just the best way to describe it would be the function of things, or the end to which things are directed. Maybe I should say purpose instead of that. Purpose of things, end to which things are directed. This is most famously derived from Aristotle. Aristotle's function argument. In the Nicomachean Ethics. The function argument basically argues something like this. Suppose you have a shipbuilder. What does the shipbuilder do? They build ships, right? When would we say a shipbuilder is most perfectly a shipbuilder? When they build ships well. If the ships sink, they're a bad shipbuilder, right? But if they attain their end, their purpose, then they're a good shipbuilder. This is pretty common sense, right? But this is, the idea behind this is teleology. So the shipbuilder's telos, which is the function of a thing, or the purpose of the thing, it's a final cause, as Aristotle would say. The telos of the shipbuilder is to build ships well. So when they attain that purpose, that function, that end to which they're directed, that's when the shipbuilder is most perfectly a shipbuilder, right? That's when it's That's what we would say. That's why they would be hired, right, as a shipbuilder. Because if you're looking for a shipbuilder, you're looking for a certain thing which seeks a certain end. You're seeking a ship. A good ship that can float, that has everything you need on it. Like, modern ships would need guns. If you're in the military. Older ships would need sails and such. So if the ship attains its purpose, its function, then we would call it good. We'd be happy with it. That's the goal that it seeks. And teleology seeks to extend this idea of function, a purpose of telos, to human actions. So, you could say, what is the function or the telos of eating? So I eat. Eating so gives nutrition to the body, right? For the sake of health. So what happens when you only eat unhealthy fast food meals without good nutrition? The body suffers, right? It's no longer healthy. We failed to attain the telos of our act of eating fully. This would be a vice. Say if we overeat, it would be the vice of gluttony. As opposed to a virtue of temperance, right eating. And we can see the effects of this as well. Right. We don't gain needed nutrition. Our bodies desire to eat more to gain that needed nutrition. Which, if we continue to eat unhealthily, never satiates our hunger. So our vice grows worse and worse. So that's the problem of vice. When you don't follow the telos of a thing, you fail to attain the end which is directed to, which means you fail to attain the good which the act seeks to attain. That and the purpose of eating, it's nutrition of the body for the sake of bodily health, basically. So when you eat unhealthily, your health suffers and your body fails to be satiated, so it still hungers for more, so you eat more. And you're still not satiated because you're still not eating well, you're still not attaining the telos of the act of eating, you're still not giving nutrition to the body, so it's still unhealthy, and you're still hungering for more, and you're still not satiated. And that's why it's a deadly spiral of gluttony. It doesn't just magically improve. You continue in that poor habit, that poor disposition. And you never attain the health which eating is supposed to attain for you. And this can be extended to all other kinds of human actions, right, as well. And that's where we get, basically, the concept of virtue ethics. This entire thing here, I'll go ahead and just do this. This is virtue ethics in a whole. This concept that the function argument, basically Nicomachean ethics are the basics of all virtue ethics. So even today, people hold the virtue ethics. Alistair MacIntyre, for example, in After Virtue, writes about this. I'll just throw on some words, I guess. This is for further reading for those interested in virtue ethics. After virtue, we have G.M. Anscombe's Modern Moral Philosophy. I probably need to move this thing, actually. Let's see, how do I move it? Oh, well, it's probably fine. Oh, here we go. Cool. And then, of course, Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics. Those are probably the biggest works in virtue ethics if you're interested in this kind of thing. But anyway, the point of this is, this meaning, where does it come from? One potential source of this meaning is teleology. It's not the only source. There's other ways you can understand meaning and describe meaning. And there's really a whole bunch of stuff. I actually wrote a previous board about this. You can see it here. And there's a lot to talk about in this topic. I just ended up kind of skipping a lot of it because you don't really need to go into all this stuff. But in general, this is the kind of thing you can look at. There's teleology. There's a way to describe human actions in an objective sense. And there's other ways, a bunch of other papers about how we might do this as well. I don't want to go over everything here. This is not a it's not a philosophy class proper. But I hope this makes some sense. There are answers, real objective meaning answers to this. And there are ways we can experience this. We don't even have to give a full, detailed account of what real objective meaning is. We can just point to objectives or into intuitions and common sense and experiences that we have, that there is meaning to things. And it seems to contradict these claims entirely. Endwalker, though, doesn't really look into the objective real meaning question. It doesn't necessarily deny it entirely, but it does kind of side skirt it. It kind of jumps straight into this question. This is, in a sense, the Endwalker question. Is between these two. Subjective meaning, existentialism kind of ideas, and nihilism, lack of meaning entirely. This is obviously the end singer is singing of nihilism, and in a sense destructive nihilism, since it's trying to destroy everything, to bring an end to everything. And subjective meaning existentialism is more so the focus of our protagonists, right? They're fighting for meaning. And you can kind of see this a lot in the dialogue they have, right? They say things like, man, this is very depressing, this is very painful, but there's meaning to our actions. We can find a greater meaning, we can forge meaning. Instead, they use kind of language like that a lot in the main storyline quest, right? You can kind of it's that sense of that passionate, we're gonna fight for it, we have hope for this thing, we're gonna go fight against the nihilism. So this is the kind of it's not as explicit. They don't explicitly go into these philosophies, obviously. They're not like, Alphino, what about Jean-Paul Sartre? Well, I don't know, it's existentially denied from beating. What about the will to power? Do you have radical freedom, Alistair? No, they don't. Obviously, they're not going to go into the in-depth philosophy. It'd be hilarious if they did, but they do not, in fact, go into the philosophy explicitly. It's more implicit. But that's kind of my rant. It's mostly focused on this. They don't talk about this at all. They don't really go into they don't find a single planet that's like, man, we found real objective meaning to life. Even though that's like our natural state. We naturally find meaning to things. It's just that instead the premise of Endwalker is this to begin with. And that's really my frustration. But there's a reason to that. There's a reason why that's the case. And it has to do with the culture of Japan in particular, but also the modern world. It's a cultural idea, and I think it's something very useful to get into more. So let's dive more into that now. We talked about a lot of Endwalker's answers to these questions, about how it presents a subjective answer and a mostly nihilistic answer, and the debate is kind of between those two. So why not present the objective answer to begin with? Well, part of that's obviously going to be for the drama of the story, right? If no planets actually despaired, or if only some of them did, Medion wouldn't have a motivation to become the Endsinger. It wouldn't have the entire story of Final Fantasy Endwalker. It'd be a much shorter story. Oh, we found some positive answers. Great, let's share it, and then that's the end of the story. Wouldn't really be much of a good game to go with. So obviously, to some degree, there had to be bad answers for the story to move forward. But there's another reason as well, and this is perhaps more pertinent to our discussion, what I want to talk about. That Final Fantasy XIV's Endwalker wasn't really approaching this question from a strictly philosophical perspective at all. But it was more so from a mythological perspective, or a poetical perspective. And to understand what I mean by that, we're going to have to go into another detour. This time to Gilbert Keith Chesterton, a British author in the early 1900s, work in his novel The Everlasting Man, where he talks about mythology and philosophy. If we turn back time a few thousand years ago, you'll enter a pagan world whose mental approach to questions like this is split between two kinds of concepts, mythology and philosophy. I emphasize pagan here not as an insult or like a passive-aggressive comment or some kind of denigration of them, as some might use the word pagan, rather just to denote the circumstances of that age. For the common citizen, mythology and philosophy were side by side, and they were both, in a sense, true in their own ways. Mythology for these ancients was not like a science, or some claim to be like solely supernatural explanations for unexplained phenomena. Like they see lightning, they don't know what it means, they make up some mythology for it. I'm sure that happened to some degree. But as poets and philosophers of these ages have talked about, the myths aren't necessarily intended to be literal stories. When Plato created myths, for example, as a philosopher, he did so as yet one more myth maker in a long line of myth makers. Myth making itself is an art, and the art piece served to communicate more poetical kinds of truths and literal truths. As an example, a Roman citizen didn't necessarily believe that there were fairies in a forest, but they loved the forest. The forest was their home, and they believed it was special enough, unique enough, meaningful enough, that there was something more to the forest, something inherently meaningful about it, that it's a magical place enough for fairies if they did exist. In this analysis, I'm going to exclude the Jewish people from this analysis because they didn't have the same mindset as the rest of the age. They were explicitly monotheistic. They were both literal and metaphorical in belief of their mythos. They were very unique in a lot of ways, so we're going to kind of not talk about them in this discussion. Philosophy, on the other hand, was more for metaphysical truths. And at times, mythology and philosophy would butt heads. As an example of this, an ancient Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, I don't know how to pronounce his name, so just bear with me if you're an expert in pronouncing these names. Forgive me for my mispronunciation. Throwing aside all the ancient Egyptian polytheistic myths, Akhenaten promulgated a monotheistic view, very reminiscent of what some Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle kind of reference in their discussions. Akhenaten took an aspect of Ra, Aten, and proclaimed it in a manner very much like an omnipotent, omniscient creator god. This bit follows from the Wikipedia article on Aten. Aten cares for every creature, and created Nile River in the sky, rain for the Syrians. Aten created all countries and people. The rays of the sun disk only holds out life to the royal family. Everyone else receives life from Akhenaten and Nefertiti in exchange for loyalty to Aten. Aten is depicted caring for the people through Akhenaten by Aten's hands extending through the royalty, giving them ankhs representing life being given to humanity through both Aten and Akhenaten. In Akhenaten's hymn to Aten, a love for humanity and the earth is depicted in Aten's mannerisms. I mean, you can see in a sense, how monotheistic it is, right? He says, Aten cares for all humanity. He created all countries. He created all peoples. He gives life to all. He cares for all. It's a big shift from the previous polytheistic view, right? And it didn't, I mean, there's not much evidence that it came from the Jewish people. The Jewish people didn't sneak into Egypt and in Akhenaten's time, at least, and convince the pharaoh to become monotheistic. Rather, this is the influence of philosophy, in a sense. And those who followed after Akhenaten didn't really approve of this change, because the enforced religion was just swept away right after him, and the pantheon was reinstated, and it's back to normal business. So while mythology and philosophy can butt heads at times like this, the common citizenry kind of saw truth in both. There was a more philosophical truth to look at, and another much more poetical, more mythological. Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man, goes into more detail on these topics, so if you want to learn more about that, please read the book. But he culminates all this discussion in the glory of Rome. Rome, the heights, the crescent wave of old humanity, reaching out to the stars, unifying the known world under one glorious banner. But even this crescent wave failed to reach the answer to the meaning of life. Even this, the crescent wave of human achievement, began to fall. As Chesterton so eloquently describes when he calls the old human world a dying world. Pages 180 and 181, he says, "It was the best sort of paganism that wore the laurels of Rome. It was the best thing the world had yet seen, all things considered on any large scale, that ruled from the wall of the Grampians to the garden of the Euphrates. It was the best that conquered, it was the best that ruled, and it was the best that began to decay. Unless this broad truth be grasped, the whole story is seen askew. Pessimism is not in being tired of evil, but in being tired of good. Despair does not lie in being weary of suffering, but in being weary of joy. It is when, for some reason or other, the good things in a society no longer work, that the society begins to decline. When its food does not feed, when its cures do not cure, when its blessings refuse to bless." You recognize the last few lines. "And the despairing final world in the dead end's dungeon. Medion reviews how a paradise planet fell into despair and prayed for death, because they had everything they wanted. And consequently, they had become weary of even their own joys and pleasures." That's precisely the dilemma which Endwalker displays, which Chesterton is talking about here. It's the dilemma which old humanity faced as glorious Rome began to decline into decadence. The dilemma that both mythology and philosophy were unable to solve by themselves. Both mythology and philosophy are a search. So what happens when they don't find an answer? The only remaining answer then is the one which Endwalker gives you, to hope to find an answer in the future. And so reject despair and the dead world which despair leads to. That's why I find Endwalker not to really be a philosophical work necessarily, but rather a work of this kind of worldview. Chesterton called it pagan, and while that's certainly true for that era, where most of the world was pagan, it's also somewhat present in modern works as well. It's not uncommon for an objective answer to the meaning of life to be discounted, immediately or implicitly, or left ambiguous. And it only really makes sense to leave it ambiguous. if you don't have an answer yourself. And that's why I consider Endwalker much more a mythological work than a philosophical one when it approaches this question. Because there are plenty of philosophical answers which answer this question positively and say there is meaning to life. And plenty, really over a majority, in a sense, of contemporary philosophers accept these answers. So it's not like it's a rare idea. It's actually more so the common idea. But the mythological part of this question, so to speak, more so the poetical part, the part relating to the human heart, the human experience, which, if you look at Japanese storytelling, it's very much about that, right? It's very much about the human heart, the human experience. That's why you have things like slice of life anime and stories about people's experiences through like high school and stuff like that. It's very much, their storytelling is much about the human experience and the emotions and the passions and such. And that's true for Final Fantasy Endwalker as well. The question of why we can grow weary of even joy, of what our greatest good really is, of what happiness and meaning we long for, these are all brought into the discussion in Endwalker, but they aren't answered positively. They're answered rather with hope. Right? It spins an emotional tale, ending in hope and excitement and joy and peace, but not an answer. And that's what I want to point out here. That's what's so essential to note, is that it doesn't give you an answer. Chesterton goes on in the second half of The Everlasting Man to give us an answer to that question. It's the answer that I arrived at myself as well, albeit differently from Chesterton, and many other philosophers have in their own way. But I'm not going to go into that right now because it's not part of Endwalker, and it's already a very long discussion. So I think it's better to just wrap up the discussion on what Endwalker says for now. But if you're interested, and I highly recommend you do, look into this. Read The Everlasting Man, along with Chesterton's other books such as Orthodoxy and The Man Who Is Thursday, which is the best fiction novel I've ever read in my entire life. Also very good philosophical work and metaphysical work. But yeah, read these books if you want to see what his answer is. But in terms of Endwalker, where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with the question still. What is the meaning of life? You've heard various philosophers answer this question, and Walker itself avoids directly answering it, instead urging us to fight despair and hope and seek for a greater answer. In so doing, Endwalker proves to be a solid, excellent story among many other modern stories which take this approach. But it still leaves us with a troubled heart, because we readers, we human beings, want to find that answer to what the meaning of our lives are. And for those of us who haven't found such an answer before reading Endwalker, we're bound to have heavy hearts as we still ponder this question ourselves. That's one of the flaws of this kind of storytelling. They still present a dying world, a world waiting for hope of an answer that can bring it back to life. I'll admit I was a bit sad when I saw how Endwalker handled this question, because I struggled with this question myself for a long period of my own life until I was blessed enough to find an answer myself. And isn't it tragic to see others undergoing the same suffering you did? When you have an answer now to help them, when do you want to help them find an answer? That's the main reason I wanted to make this video, for the people who are still struggling with this question, or questions like this. I've been there. And all I can recommend is that you really give Chesterton's books, The Everlasting Man and Orthodoxy, a read. Because even though I only read him after I found my own answer to this question, he describes a very similar journey. He seeks the answer to the same questions, and he finds the same answer that many of us did. And he writes about it much better than I do. Albeit from a culture 100 years ago, so some words and phrases may be hard to understand, or they may have different contexts for modern readers. Still, he's one of the best authors in English, so if for nothing else, give it a good read. And I'll give you my own answer directly, but a short answer wouldn't really communicate the truth very well, and a long answer is deserving of its own discussion. And especially since there's other answers to this question, which I need to cover if I'm being a full and holistic philosopher. So I'll table that for now. But I can say there's no need to be afraid there's no meaning to life. No need to be afraid that there's no goodness or goodness itself is fake, or that if we were to find happiness, we would be tired of it and be yet another dead end. We tire of goods not because we are tired of goodness itself, but the opposite, because we experienced all the kinds of goodnesses we can find and we still haven't found goodness itself, the ultimate end to which these goods are directed. A people seeking novelty, going from good to good and growing tired of these goods happens precisely because they haven't found goodness itself. Precisely because when this question of ultimate purpose and end has no answer, the intermediate goods become fake and empty and dull. One cannot journey without no destination forever. Eventually, one must ascertain the ultimate final end to seek, goodness itself, that by which all these other things have their meaning and their being. Without it, this whole project of goodness begins to die from an ultimate purposelessness, as we have seen. The good news is there is such an ultimate end, such a thing as goodness itself. Though again, I'll leave that to a different discussion. I hope you all learned a great deal from this. I've skimmed down a lot of the discussion because it's running too long as it is. I'm sure I'll get some comments like, this philosopher, you're describing him as existentialist. That's not really the full story, and I'll grant you I was brief on a lot of parts of this because I didn't want to go into a multi-hour discussion on this, right? If you want to learn more about these details, check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You can check out all these philosophers. Nietzsche, Sartre, existentialism, meaning of life, articles are on all of those. Aristotle. So I recommend you start with those. If you're new to philosophy, I recommend you start with the Socratic dialogues, and then maybe move into Aristotle after that. All right, and that's everything. It took a lot longer than I expected. This turned out to be a really long video, but I hope it was interesting to you all. I know I'm not exactly the most exciting and passionate speaker out there, but this stuff is important to me. And if you are interested in philosophy, in this stuff, then hopefully this is good for you. Hopefully you learned a lot. Hopefully you want to learn more. Again, if you want to learn more about philosophy, you can check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Check out the resources I just mentioned with the Socratic dialogues. And check out more videos and comment below, and so I actually know people want to see more of this. I suspect that's not the case, and I'm pretty sure this will just be my rant channel where I just throw on rants about different philosophical topics. Then maybe stream games occasionally, but other than that, it's not my job. I'm just here to talk about philosophy, something I love. So, in any case, I hope that passion of mine for philosophy, and truth and games, as it were, is useful to you all. Alright, I've taken enough of your time. I'll see you later.